Welcome back to Drowsy History. If this is your first time here, welcome. Settle in wherever you are. Let your body go heavy. Let your breathing slow down. There is nowhere you need to be and nothing left to do tonight. And if at some point the words start to blur and your thoughts start to drift, that is exactly right. That is what we are here for. Before we begin, if you get the chance, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. It means a lot to picture all these different people in all these different time zones settling into the same quiet story at the same moment. And if drowsy history is helping you sleep, a gentle subscribe keeps the channel going and means more of these long, slow stories keep finding their way to you. Tonight we are going somewhere ancient, somewhere warm and marble floored and loud and perfumed and complicated. We are going to Rome, the Rome of the Republic and the early empire, the city of 1 million people at the height of its power, the city of the Forum and the Palatine and the Tiber and the Subura, the city that considered itself the center of the world and was not entirely wrong. And we are going to inhabit a very specific life within it. You are going to be a meretrix, a courtesan, a woman who sold her company and her body in the most stratified and scrutinized city in the ancient world under a legal system that had very clear opinions about what you were allowed to do, what you were forbidden from doing, and what would happen to you if you stepped outside those boundaries. A woman who occupied simultaneously a position of cultural fascination and legal degradation, who was in some respects freer than a Roman wife, and in almost every other respect in a far more precarious position than almost anyone else in the city. We are going to walk through your day. We are going to spend time in your room, in the streets you moved through, in the places you worked and ate and slept and tried to make a life in. We are going to be honest about what was hard and what was harder still, and we are going to do it slowly in the voice of this particular channel, which means that none of it is going to be rushed and none of it is going to be more alarming than it needs to be, and the whole of it is going to be a gentle, unhurried drift through a world that was like all worlds, made up mostly of ordinary days. So close your eyes whenever you're ready. Take a slow breath, and let's go back together. You wake before the city does, or rather, you wake when the city is at its thinnest, that particular hour of the early morning when even Rome, which never truly sleeps, has reduced itself to a low murmur. The carts that are not permitted in the city streets during the day have been rumbling through since midnight, their iron wheels on the stone sending vibrations up through the walls of whatever building you sleep in. That sound has been the bass note of your nights for as long as you have lived here, and you have mostly stopped hearing it the way you have mostly stopped smelling the city, which is to say you are aware of it without registering it, the way you are aware of your own heartbeat. The room is small. In Rome, almost all rooms are small because Rome is a city of extraordinary density, built upward when it could not build outward, the insulae rising 5 and 6 and 7 stories in the poorer districts, the apartments stacked on top of each other in arrangements that the fire inspectors of later centuries would have found nightmarish and that you simply find normal. Your room is on the second or third floor of such a building, probably in the Subura or somewhere near it, the low district, the dense district, the district that no self respecting Roman of the upper classes would claim as their address. But that contains, like if you know where to look, the entire architecture of the city's unofficial life. The walls are plastered and may once have been painted. The floor is bare stone. There is a window, small and shuttered, and a lamp that you have let burn low through the night, because complete darkness is something you have never been comfortable with. This is where your day begins. And in a moment, we are going to describe exactly what that day looks like. All of it, from the first cold water on your face to the last transaction of the evening and the long road home. But first, let us take a moment to understand exactly where you are. Not just in the room, in the world, in the legal and social and economic structure of Rome, which is the structure that will determine everything about your life, and which is considerably more specific and more strange than most people imagine when they picture what it meant to be a woman like you in ancient Rome. You are a meretrix. The word comes from the Latin merere, to earn, and it means, at its most literal, simply a woman who earns money. But in the specific context of Roman law and Roman society, it means something considerably more defined than that, and understanding the precise social and legal category you occupy is essential to understanding why almost every aspect of your daily life is the way it is. Roman society organized women into a hierarchy of status that was very clearly defined and very rigidly maintained. At the top were the matronae, the married women of respectable families, the wives and mothers of Roman citizens, whose virtue was a civic as well as a personal matter, and whose behavior was subject to the scrutiny of their husbands, their families, and in certain periods, the active enforcement of the censors. The matrona was protected, honored, and constrained in equal measure. She was not supposed to be seen in certain public places, was expected to comport herself with specific dignified modesty in all situations, and derived her social position entirely from her relationship to the men in her family. You are not a matrona. You are her opposite, legally and socially, in a system that required both extremes to function. Roman law, particularly under the Republic and into the Principate, was explicit about the existence and the necessity of women like you. The great Roman orator Cato the Elder, who was not a particularly sympathetic figure by most reckonings, made a statement that was radical enough to be remembered for centuries. When a young man was seen leaving a brothel, Cato praised him for taking his appetites to an appropriate outlet, rather than pursuing the wives of respectable men. The logic was the logic of a hydraulic system. Desire would go somewhere, and it was better that it went to women who had been designated for the purpose than that it destabilized the marriages and households that Roman civic order depended on. This logic, however flattering it was not to you personally, had a structural consequence. The Roman state needed you to exist and had a limited interest in pretending otherwise. Unlike in some other ancient cultures, prostitution in Rome was not illegal, was not generally persecuted, and was not culturally invisible. It was taxed. The vectigul meretricum, the prostitution tax, was a formal revenue source for the Roman state from at least the early imperial period, and the existence of a tax implies the existence of an administrative apparatus for collecting it, which implies registration, which implies official acknowledgement. You were registered with the aedules, the civic magistrates, responsible for public order and the regulation of commerce. You had a name on a list. You were known. What registration gave you was, in a paradoxical way, a form of legal existence. What it took from you was considerably more. The moment you registered as a meretrix, you became a person of infamia, a legal concept that covered a range of individuals whose work was considered degrading and who were therefore deprived of certain fundamental citizen rights. Gladiators had infamia, actors had infamia, pimps and panders had infamia, and prostitutes had infamia. It meant you could not bring certain kinds of legal actions. It meant you could not marry a Roman citizen of the senatorial or equestrian orders. It meant that certain public spaces and certain ceremonies were closed to you, not by informal social pressure, but by legal prohibition. It meant that if someone did you harm, your ability to seek legal redress was significantly more limited than that of a person without infamia, which was a practical vulnerability that informed every aspect of how you moved through the city. There was, within the broad category of sex work, a hierarchy of its own, and your position within it mattered enormously to the texture of your daily life. At the lowest level were the women who worked in the fornaces, the arched niches, and small cells built into the massive foundations of public buildings, where transactions were conducted in conditions of extreme brevity and minimal comfort, where prices were low and volume was high, and the work was grinding in a way that had very little in common with any romanticized notion of the ancient world. The word fornix gives us the English word fornication, which tells you something about how prevalent this form of commerce was. Above that were the lupanar, the brothels, the dedicated commercial establishments with multiple rooms and multiple women and a standard menu of services and prices painted on the walls, some of which have been preserved at Pompeii with extraordinary specificity. Above that were the independent meretrices who worked in taverns and inns and baths, who had somewhat more autonomy over their clients and their conditions. And above that, a category that straddled the line between courtesan and companion, and which carried its own complicated status, were the meretrices, nobles, or doctae, the educated, cultured women who offered conversation and intellectual companionship alongside the physical, who entertained clients in more domestic settings, who sometimes maintained longer-term arrangements with wealthy patrons that were economically more like kept woman situations than straight commercial transactions. You occupy somewhere in the middle of this hierarchy, not the lowest levels, where the conditions were brutal and the autonomy minimal, not the very top, which was a position that required resources of education, appearance, and social connection that not every woman could accumulate. Somewhere in the working middle of the profession, where the life was hard but not completely defined by survival, where some choices remained available even if they were not many, and where the daily texture of existence was a negotiation between what the city demanded and what you could manage to hold on to for yourself. That is where we are. That is where your day begins. The first thing you do when you wake is assess. This is not a conscious habit you developed. It is something that has become automatic over the years, the body's own morning accounting. You lie still for a moment and take stock of what you feel. The back, which is sometimes sore, the feet, which are always sore, the face, which you will need shortly. The slow, practiced inventory of a person who has learned that their body is their primary professional instrument and that its condition each morning sets the terms for the day ahead. The water you wash with comes from a jug that you filled from the fountain the night before, or that a servant or a building neighbor has brought up from the street level basin. It is cold, always cold, and it does what cold water always does. It makes you present. There is no gradual easing into the day for you, no slow cup of something warm consumed in bed while the morning announces itself at a distance. The cold water arrives and the day begins. Personal hygiene in Rome is both more sophisticated and more limited than most modern people expect, and the gap between those two things, between what Rome had developed and what it had not, is a very particular gap that you navigate every day. Rome had public baths, the thermae, which were genuine architectural and social achievements, large, heated, multi-room establishments that offered hot baths, cold baths, steam rooms, and various facilities for exercise and socializing, accessible for a small fee that was sometimes waived or subsidized by wealthy patrons seeking public favor. The baths were one of the places you could go to wash properly, to have your hair attended to be seen in a semi-public setting, and they were an important part of the day's rhythm for most Romans who had access to them. You used them when the timing was right and when you needed what they offered. What Rome did not have, and what you therefore also did not have, was plumbing in your room. The water you used for washing, for drinking, for cleaning came from wherever you carried it from. Waste, human waste, kitchen waste, the general refuse of daily life, was disposed of in ways that ranged from the chamber pot emptied out the window, technically illegal, practically everywhere, to the ground floor latrines that some buildings had, to the public latrines that were one of Rome's genuine civic achievements and that were social spaces in their own right, the seats arranged side by side without partitions, the waste flowing beneath on a channel of water, the whole arrangement entirely without privacy, and therefore entirely communal in the way that so many Roman civic spaces were communal. Your body requires specific and deliberate maintenance, and the Romans had developed a fairly sophisticated toolkit for it. Olive oil was the basic medium of everything, used for cleaning the skin in the absence of soap. The strigil, a curved metal scraper, removed oil and dirt together when you had access to bath facilities. Used in hair care, used as the base for the perfumed unguents that were a significant part of how wealthy Romans smelled. Pumice stone was used for hair removal, which was a standard expectation for women of your profession. Body hair was considered unattractive in women, and its removal was assumed. The Romans had various depilatories made from combinations of resin, pitch, and various caustic substances that were applied and then removed along with the hair, a process that was both painful and unreliable in approximately equal measure. Hair removal was a recurring task rather than a permanent solution, which meant it was a recurring discomfort built into the rhythm of your personal maintenance. Your hair, if you kept your own, was an important professional asset. Roman standards of female beauty included specific preferences for hair color and style, and the fashion for blonde and reddish hair, which was not the most common natural coloring in Italy, had created a lively trade in wigs and hair extensions made from the hair of captives from the northern provinces, particularly Germany and the Rhine regions. The blonde wig was a specific cultural signifier in Rome, associated with a certain type of female sexual availability, and you may have owned one, may have worn it, may have found the association useful, or may have found it humiliating, depending on your particular relationship to what your work required of you and what you could separate from it. The cosmetics available to you in Rome were both impressive in their sophistication and alarming in their ingredients. White lead, cerussa, was the standard foundation cosmetic applied to the face to achieve the pale, smooth appearance that Roman beauty standards favored, and the lead content was genuinely toxic over time, contributing to a range of health problems that the Romans partially understood and mostly ignored. Coal and antimony were used to darken the eyes. Red ochre and wine lees were used for lip and cheek color. The whole effect, applied skillfully, could be transformative and was intended to be. Cosmetics in Rome were not a subtle enhancement of natural features, but a deliberate construction of a face for public presentation, a mask in the practical sense, if not always the literal one. The process of putting this face together each morning took time and required either your own skill or the assistance of a servant. A woman in your position who had accumulated enough stability to employ a personal servant, an ornatrix, a hairdresser attendant, was considerably better positioned than one who had to manage everything herself, because the hairdressing alone, the complex pinning and styling and oiling that Roman women's hairdressing required, was awkward to perform on your own head and time-consuming in any case. The personal servant was both a practical assistance and a social indicator, evidence that you had achieved a level of stability and income that allowed you to stop doing absolutely everything yourself. The clothing you put on over all of this was specific to your profession in ways that Roman law was explicit about. You were required to wear the toga, the garment of Roman men and of prostitutes, a pairing that tells you something about Roman symbolic thinking. While the respectable Roman matron wore the stola, the long draped dress that marked her status and her virtue, you wore the toga, which dressed you simultaneously in the garment of citizenship and in the marker of your infamia. The color was often brightly dyed in the yellows and saffrons that were associated with your profession. In practice, many women of your category wore clothing that was legally ambiguous, brightly colored, more revealing, not precisely the stola, but not precisely the toga either, and the line between legal requirement and practical custom was one that was enforced inconsistently and that you probably navigated by instinct and experience rather than by precise legal calculation. What you wore mattered in Rome in a way that is difficult to overstate, because clothing was a semiotic system in a highly literate visual culture, and everyone who saw you could read your dress the way they could read a sign. The matron in her stola communicated her status in the first second of being seen. You, in your toga or your bright-dyed dress, communicated yours. There was no neutral costume available to you. The body that was your instrument was also, at all times, a public statement about what you were. Rome, at the height of the empire, contained somewhere between 1 and 2 million people. The estimates vary, and the certainty is impossible, and it was, by any measure, the largest city in the Western world, and one of the largest in the entire ancient world. Moving through it was an experience of density and noise and smell and color that has no real parallel in the modern experience of historical tourism, where the marble is white and the streets are quiet, and the whole thing has been cleaned to the point of abstraction. The living Rome was none of those things. The streets of the Subura, where you probably lived and worked, were narrow enough in places that two carts could not pass each other, which is why cart traffic was restricted to the night. They were unpaved in the smaller alleys and paved with the large basalt blocks of the major thoroughfares, uneven enough to be treacherous in bad light and worse in rain, constantly populated with the various flows of city life. Vendors, workers, slaves, soldiers, beggars, children, animals, the general undifferentiated press of a city that never stopped moving. The noise was constant, the vendors calling their wares, the hammer of the smith, the argument from the apartment above, the creak and groan of a heavily loaded cart that had made it through the night curfew by a narrow margin, the sound of water from the fountain at the end of the street. The smell was, there is no polite way to say this, extraordinary. Rome had a drainage system, the Cloaca Maxima, that was an engineering achievement of the first order, and it had public latrines and an aqueduct system that was the envy of the ancient world. But it was also a city of 1 million people and their animals, their food waste, their chamber pots, their tanneries and fulling vats and butchers and fishmongers, all in close proximity, in a climate that ranged from cold and damp in winter to hot and airless in summer. The smell of Rome was a complex layering of these things: the meat from the market, the urine from the fullers who collected it for its ammonia content, the cooking smells from the street food stalls that were everywhere because most apartments had no cooking facilities, the river smell of the Tiber that ran through the low parts of the city, and that served as a combination of water source, drainage channel, and occasional dump. You had lived inside this smell for long enough that you no longer consciously perceived it, but it was the medium of your daily life as surely as the noise and the press of bodies. Moving through the city required a specific kind of navigational awareness that was second nature to you, and that would take a newcomer months to develop. The social geography of Rome was as layered and specific as its physical geography, and the different districts carried different meanings and different dangers and different opportunities. The Subura was your native territory, dense, poor, loud, full of the various commercial and semi-commercial activities that the upper-class districts preferred not to think about too directly. The Forum was a space you could access, but that carried specific social implications for a woman of your status. It was primarily a male public space, a space for civic business and public oratory, and a woman moving through it alone was visible in ways that were not always comfortable. The Palatine, where the imperial family and the senatorial aristocracy had their houses, was not your world, except on the specific occasions when you were invited into it, which happened more than the aristocracy's public posture would have suggested. The baths were one of the genuinely public spaces where the social hierarchy was partially suspended, or at least differently organized. The major thermae, the baths of Agrippa, the baths of Nero, and eventually the enormous imperial bath complexes that would be built in later centuries, were accessible to virtually anyone with the small entry fee, and inside them, the democratic principle of shared nakedness created a kind of temporary equality that Roman public life usually resisted. You used the baths for their practical purposes: cleaning, maintenance, the particular Roman pleasure of the progression from cold room to warm room to hot room that relaxed the body in specific and satisfying ways, and also for their social ones. The baths were places where conversations happened, where relationships were initiated, where information moved, where you could be seen in a setting that was somewhat more neutral than the street or the tavern. The streets at night were a different world from the streets during the day. Rome had no public lighting. The torches and lamps hung outside particular establishments provided their specific pools of light, but between them the streets were genuinely dark in ways that the modern urban experience does not prepare you for. Moving through the city after dark required a lantern, which required someone to carry it, or a familiarity with the routes so deep that you could navigate them by feel and memory. Much of your professional life took place in the evening and the night, which meant you had developed that familiarity. The night streets were not safe in the ways that dark, crowded streets full of drunk men and absent official oversight are never entirely safe, and the awareness of your vulnerability in those conditions was part of the background of everything you did in them. What protection you had came from various sources, none of them entirely reliable. The vigils, the night watchmen who were Rome's closest equivalent to a police force, were primarily concerned with fire prevention and had limited interest in the personal safety of women of your status. The connections you had developed with other people in the neighborhood, the bar owner on the corner who knew your name, the building neighbor who had a large dog, the group of women working similar territory, provided a more practical kind of security based on mutual recognition and the informal enforcement of social norms in a community where everyone's continued presence depended on a minimum of order. You had learned who to avoid and where to avoid them, and what to do when avoidance was not possible, and this knowledge was not something you had been taught, but something you had accumulated through experience, which meant it had cost you something before it had protected you. Let us talk about money, because money is the structure inside which everything else in your life operates, and understanding the economics of your situation, who you paid, who paid you, what things cost, what you could and could not afford, is essential to understanding the actual texture of your days. The prices charged for sexual services in Rome ranged enormously by the status and setting of the woman providing them and the client seeking them. The lowest prices, documented at Pompeii and elsewhere, were just a few asses, the smallest denomination of Roman currency, barely enough to buy a loaf of bread. The highest, for the most sought after women in the most elaborate arrangements, could be enormous. The fees associated with the most famous courtesans of the Republic and early Empire are recorded in numbers that represent small fortunes. You were somewhere in the middle of this range, charging enough to sustain yourself and maintain the standards your clientele expected, not enough to accumulate the kind of wealth that would have provided real security. From your earnings, money flowed outward in multiple directions simultaneously, and the management of those flows was one of the central practical challenges of your life. First and most pressing was the leno or lena, the pimp or madam, the procurer who may or may not have been a direct presence in your working life, depending on whether you worked in an establishment they operated or whether you worked more independently, and paid them a percentage for protection and introductions and the management of the various administrative complications of your situation. The relationship with a leno or lena was one of the most fraught in your world, necessary because the alternatives were often worse, and exploitative because the power differential was large and the leno's incentives were not aligned with yours. Under Roman law, the leno occupied an interesting and uncomfortable position. They had infamia, like you. They could be prosecuted under certain circumstances for the specific abuses of their role, but they also had practical power over the women in their orbit that the law did not effectively constrain, because the women who might have complained about that power were themselves of infamia and therefore had limited recourse. The leno who overcharged, who took a larger cut than agreed, who required services that had not been agreed to, who used physical force as a management tool, such a person operated in a legal gray zone that in practice was closer to gray-black, and the women subject to their authority had to navigate it through the same combination of compliance, calculation, and occasional courage that characterized the navigation of all the power imbalances in your life. Beyond the leno, there was the rent. Your room cost money, and the insular apartments of the Subura were not cheap relative to the wages available to the people who lived in them. This is a feature of every dense urban housing market in every era, that the poorest housing in the most expensive city is still expensive relative to what the people living in it earn. Your landlord, the insularius, who managed the building on behalf of some absent wealthy owner, wanted his money on a regular schedule and had various legal and practical mechanisms for extracting it if you fell behind. Falling behind on rent was one of the fastest routes from precarious stability to genuine crisis, and maintaining the payments was a priority that structured your working schedule in direct ways. How many clients per week was a number that began with what the rent required: food and its preparation. In an apartment without a kitchen, and most Roman apartments did not have kitchens because the fire risk in the densely packed wooden upper stories of the insulae was too high, your eating was organized around the thermopolium, the street-level hot food counter that was the Roman equivalent of the fast food establishment. These were everywhere in Rome's commercial districts, identifiable by their distinctive counters, with large ceramic storage jars set into the stone surface, offering hot food at prices the working population could access. The food was simple: grain-based dishes, stews with vegetables, and sometimes meat, bread, olives, cheese, the ubiquitous garum fish sauce that seasoned almost everything Roman cooking touched. It was not luxurious, but it was sufficient, and the variety available in a large city meant that eating was not the monotonous ordeal it could be in smaller places. Clothing, cosmetics, and the various items of personal maintenance that your profession required were ongoing expenses that could not be avoided. The white lead for your face was cheap but not free. The perfumed oils were expensive relative to plain oil. The specific clothing that your profession and your status required cost money and wore out and needed replacing. The wig, if you kept one, required care and periodic replacement. All of it was money flowing outward, and all of it was money that came in only through the work. The tax. The vectigal meretricum arrived periodically, collected by the tax farmers who held the concession for the prostitution tax in whatever district you worked in. It was assessed against your earnings and required payment on a schedule that the collector determined, not you. The existence of the tax was, in a peculiar way, a form of official recognition. You paid taxes to the Roman state, which meant the Roman state acknowledged your existence and your activity as part of the economy. But it was recognition without any corresponding protection or service, the state's relationship to you being purely extractive in this regard, as in most others. What was left after all of this moved outward, after the leno and the rent and the food and the clothing and the cosmetics and the tax, was yours? And in most months, it was not very much. Accumulating savings under these conditions required a specific kind of discipline and a specific kind of luck, and the women who managed it were those who had either extraordinarily good fortune in the form of wealthy and generous patrons, or extraordinary discipline in the management of money, or both. The ones who had neither found themselves, as they aged, and as their earning power declined with age, in increasingly difficult circumstances. The question of what happened to a woman of your profession when she could no longer work was one that you probably did not think about directly, because it was the kind of thought that did not improve with examination. But it was there in the background, the way all the things you could not afford to look at directly were there. The men who came to you were Rome, all of it, not a specific sliver of it. This is worth saying clearly, because the popular imagination tends to either elevate the clients of ancient courtesans into philosophers and patricians, or reduce them to the anonymous lowest common denominator of male appetite, and neither of those pictures is accurate. Your clients were the city, in the full variety of what a city of 1,000,000 people contained. There were slaves. This is the first and perhaps most surprising thing to register. Enslaved men in Rome had access, within the constraints of their enslavement, to the commercial sex industry, and the prices at the lower end of the market were calculated partly to be within the reach of a slave's peculium, the limited personal funds that many enslaved people accumulated with their master's tolerance or knowledge. A slave client was a client like any other in the functional sense, except that the transaction was embedded in the additional complexity of his legal status, which could create complications around payment and around the terms of the encounter that you had to manage carefully. There were freedmen, former slaves who had been manumitted and who occupied the complicated intermediate status of Roman freedom, legally free but socially situated in a specific and somewhat constrained position below the freeborn citizen. Freedmen were often in the trades and crafts that Rome's commercial economy required, often had more money than their social position suggested, and were reliable clients. There were soldiers, Rome's legions, and the auxiliary forces, and the urban cohorts, and the Praetorian Guard, all stationed men in or near the city at various times, and soldiers were a significant part of the commercial sex economy in every ancient port and garrison town. A soldier's pay was regular and predictable, his time ashore from military duties limited but concentrated, and his appetite for the specific pleasures of urban life after the specific deprivations of garrison or campaign life was both real and commercially important. Dealing with soldiers required its own kind of skill, the management of the physical confidence and occasional volatility that military training and culture produced in men who had been given both weapons and the expectation of authority, but it was a skill you had developed. There were tradespeople, merchants, craftsmen, the middle range of Roman free society who did not have the wealth of the aristocracy and the precarity of the very poor, who had money and wanted what money could buy, and whose visits were the bread and butter transactions of your working life. Unremarkable in themselves, they made up the majority of your client base, and the relationship with them was professional in the most ordinary sense. Services were exchanged for payment, pleasantries were made and received, the encounter was completed, the client departed. There were occasionally men of the upper orders. Roman law prohibited senators and equestrians from formally marrying women of infamia, but it placed no prohibition on their visiting them, and the social reality of Roman aristocratic male life included a fairly routine engagement with the commercial sex industry that was treated as an unremarkable feature of the landscape. A senator visiting a meretrix was not remarkable. A senator being seen visiting a meretrix, depending on the political climate and the specific senator, might be. The management of that distinction between what was acceptable in private and what was visible in public was something you understood and accommodated. You did not discuss your clients. You did not use their names. What happened in your room stayed in your room, not out of any particular sense of professional ethics, but out of the straightforward calculation that discretion was what kept clients coming back and what kept you safe. Some clients wanted only what the commercial transaction specified. Others wanted more than that, and the more took various forms. There were men who wanted to talk, to be heard, to have the experience of someone's undivided attention in a world where undivided attention was not something their ordinary social lives provided. There were men who wanted the performance of a specific kind of intimacy, the warmth, the interest, the apparent affection that was distinct from and in some ways more difficult than the physical services. There were men who became, over time, something that was not quite a regular client, and not quite a patron, and not quite something else. Men whose visits accumulated into a kind of relationship that had its own emotional weight for both parties, weight that you had to manage carefully because the emotional arithmetic of your life did not have room for many debts of that kind. The most economically significant relationship available to a woman in your position was the patron arrangement, the wealthy man who paid not per visit, but in an ongoing way, who maintained a woman in a kind of semi-private arrangement that combined sexual availability with the various companionship and social functions that a well-educated, well-presented meretrix could provide. This was the top of the economic hierarchy in your world, the arrangement that provided stability and something approaching security, and it was the aspiration that the more ambitious of your colleagues organized their professional lives around. Getting there required the right combination of beauty, intelligence, social skill, and luck, and maintaining it required all of those things, plus a constant, exhausting vigilance about the patron's moods, needs, and wandering attention. The patron's interest in you was real, but contingent in ways that the patron's interest in a wife was not. A wife was a legal and social institution with protections, however imperfect, embedded in Roman law and Roman custom. You were a preference, subject to revision when the preference changed, when a younger woman captured his attention, when his wife's family became politically inconvenient to ignore, when his circumstances changed in ways that affected his appetite for or ability to maintain the arrangement. The patron could end the arrangement at any time without legal consequence, and the woman it ended for would find herself back at the beginning, in the market, at whatever age the arrangement had ended, which might be an age at which the market was less favorable than it had been when she first entered it. We have touched on the law at various points, but it deserves its own section because the specific legal situation of a Roman meretrix was one of the most precisely articulated and in many ways most punishing aspects of her life, and because understanding it changes the way everything else looks. Roman law was, by the standards of the ancient world, remarkably developed and sophisticated. The Romans were inventors of a legal culture that would shape European jurisprudence through the medieval period, the Renaissance, and into the modern world, and the precision and range of their legal thinking is genuinely impressive. It was also, in its treatment of women, and particularly of women of infamia, an instrument of precise and deliberate subordination. The concept of infamia as applied to you was not a vague social disapproval expressed in legal language. It was a specific legal status with specific legal consequences, most of which were about removing from you the protections and powers that Roman law theoretically extended to citizens. You could not serve as a legal witness in certain proceedings. You could not act as a guardian. You could not bring a legal action for certain kinds of harm done to you, or could do so only under conditions that made the action practically very difficult. The man who robbed you, beat you, or killed you was not facing the same legal consequences as the man who did the same to a woman without infamia, and the difference was not theoretical. The adultery laws that had been codified under Augustus as part of his moral reform program are particularly revealing of how the law thought about you. The Lex Julia de Adulteris et Stupro made it a criminal offense for a Roman man of citizen status to have sex with an unmarried Roman woman of respectable status without her family's consent, and for a married woman to have sex with anyone other than her husband. The penalties were serious: exile, loss of property, sometimes worse. These laws were meant to protect the institution of Roman marriage and the legitimate transmission of property and citizenship through legitimate children. You were explicitly exempt from these protections. The law made clear that the prohibitions against stuprum, illicit sexual conduct, did not apply to transactions involving meretrices. This meant that a man who forced himself on you could not be prosecuted under the stuprum laws, because what he did to you was not classified as stuprum. It also meant that you were, in a quite specific legal sense, outside the boundary of sexual protection that Roman law drew around respectable women. The line it drew was explicit. On one side, women whose sexual integrity the law protected; on the other, women for whom no such protection existed. You were on the other side of that line, and the Roman legal system had put you there deliberately, as a feature rather than a bug. The sumptuary laws that regulated dress and display in public were another area where the law reached into your daily life in ways that were simultaneously trivializing and significant. The requirement to wear the toga rather than the stola, the public marking of your status through your clothes, was an exercise in civic semiotics that Rome conducted with great seriousness. The Romans believed that public order was maintained partly through the legibility of social categories, that if you could look at a woman and immediately read her status from her dress, you knew how to treat her and what interactions were and were not appropriate. The requirement was about making you legible as a category, which served civic purposes while treating you as a sign rather than a person. There was also the specific vulnerability created by your relationship to Roman family law. You could not legally marry a Roman citizen of the upper orders. You could not, therefore, inherit from such a man under the standard rules of legitimate inheritance, even if he had intended you to benefit from his estate. Men who wanted to provide for women in your position had to use legal structures, trusts, gifts made during their lifetime, the use of intermediaries that were more complicated and more easily challenged than straightforward inheritance. The wealthy patron who died unexpectedly, having intended to leave you the means to retire comfortably, might leave you nothing legally recoverable if his heirs chose to contest, which they usually did, because the law gave them grounds and personal reasons gave them motivation. Property you did accumulate was subject to specific vulnerabilities. The freedwoman who had saved enough to buy her own room had more security than the woman dependent on a leno's premises, but she was still navigating a legal environment in which her ownership could be challenged in various ways, and in which her ability to defend that ownership through the courts was constrained by her infamia. The full protections of Roman property law applied to her in theory, and in practice often did not. This was not an accident. It was a design feature of a system that needed women like you to exist, but had limited interest in your accumulation of independence. What protection you had came from informal sources more than formal ones. The local magistrates who knew you, the neighbors who recognized your presence in the community, the occasional wealthy patron whose self-interest included protecting his investment. These were the practical sources of security, all of them contingent, and none of them guaranteed. You lived inside a legal system of extraordinary sophistication that had with considerable precision determined exactly what protections to extend to you and what to withhold, and the result was a person who existed within the law and outside its protection simultaneously, which is a position that required constant, exhausting management. The middle part of your day, in the hours between the morning's preparations and the evening's work, was your own in ways that the evening was not, and what you did with it tells us something about who you were beyond the category the law had assigned you. You ate somewhere around midday at one of the thermopolia near where you lived. The meal was hot and simple, a grain porridge, or a stew, or bread with olives and a bit of cheese, the standard fare of the working population of Rome, and you ate it standing at the counter or sitting on the street steps in the company of whatever neighbors and passers-by happened to be there at the same time. The thermopolium was a social space as well as a commercial one, and the conversations that happened over the food counter were part of how the neighborhood's information circulated, who had been in trouble with the landlord, which new Leno had set up on the corner, what was happening at the games this week, who had given birth and who had died. The games were a significant feature of Roman public life, and your relationship to them was complicated by your status in interesting ways. The munera, gladiatorial games, and the ludi, Theatrical and racing events were public entertainments on a scale that Rome provided with considerable frequency, and they were in theory accessible to almost anyone. In practice, seating in the amphitheater and the circus was hierarchically organized, with the best seats reserved for senators and equestrians and priests and vestals, the next tier for citizens of various categories, and the upper tiers for everyone else. Women of respectable status were restricted to the upper tiers, or in some periods, entirely separate sections, in a spatial arrangement that made their virtue visible through their distance from the action. You, as a woman of infamia, were in a different position, not entirely excluded, but seated in the areas associated with your status, which were the upper and back sections, far from the senators and near the slaves and foreigners. That you were there at all, that Rome's great public entertainments were accessible to you, was something. That you were marked as what you were even in the act of watching them was something else. The baths you visited in the afternoon, when the largest thermi were at their busiest and most social, the baths of Agrippa or one of the smaller neighborhood baths would have served you, and the afternoon hours were the time when the social mixing the baths enabled was at its most various. You undressed, as everyone undressed, and entered the sequence of rooms, the apoditerium, where you left your clothes, the tepidarium with its warm air, the caldarium with its heat and steam, the frigidarium with its cold plunge pool, moving through the progression that Roman bathing culture had refined into a ritual as specific as liturgy. The conversations that happened in the baths were less guarded than conversations outside. Something about the shared nakedness and the physical relaxation loosening social caution in ways that the street did not. You had made connections in bathhouses that were professionally useful. You had also made connections there that were simply human, which were rarer and more precious. Your education, to the extent you had one, was a complicated subject. Literacy among women in Rome was more widespread than later periods' assumptions about ancient literacy might suggest, particularly among the urban population of a large city and the commercial and social necessity of reading simple texts, prices, signs, basic documents, meant that complete illiteracy was less common than might be expected. Whether you could read and how well depended on your background, which we will come to. But among the women who occupied the upper tiers of your profession, a more developed literacy and education was expected and cultivated because the educated courtesan who could discuss Virgil or argue about Stoicism or write an accomplished letter had a specific market advantage over the one who could not. The Greek hetairai, the highly educated courtesans of Athens who had been culturally prominent enough to be remembered by name across centuries, Aspasia, Phryne, Laius, were an aspirational model in Roman culture, and the Roman meretrix docta, the learned courtesan, was a real figure who cultivated intellectual accomplishment as a professional tool. Whether you were such a woman, or aspired to be, or simply got through the afternoon with the more modest entertainments available in the neighborhood, the informal music from the bar on the corner, the gossip with the woman upstairs, the occasional letter sent or received, the afternoon was yours in a way the evening was not, and the quality of those hours, however simple they were, was part of what sustained you through the hours that were not your own. The evening is when the city changes register, and you change with it. The shift happens gradually. The light changes first, the hard afternoon brightness, softening into something more forgiving, the long shadows of the buildings, making the streets feel different from how they felt at midday. The city's noise shifts its quality, less of the daytime commerce and more of the evening's different business, the taverns beginning to fill, the smell of cooking intensifying, the general human sound of a million people moving from the day's work toward whatever the evening holds. You have been preparing since the afternoon. The cosmetics that you applied in the morning have been refreshed. The hair has been redressed. The clothing you put on for the evening is different from what you wore during the day, brighter, perhaps, or more carefully chosen for a specific kind of visibility. The preparation is professional and methodical, the same routine executed with the same attention each time, but it has its own specific feeling that is difficult to categorize simply as either pleasant or unpleasant. It is what it is. It is what the evening requires. The tavern, the taberna, or the copona was one of the primary working environments for women of your profession who were not attached to a dedicated brothel. The taverns of Rome ranged from the respectable establishments attached to better neighborhoods where food and wine were the primary business, through the middle range of working class eating and drinking places, to the lower establishments of the Subura and the Aventine waterfront, where the wine was rough and the clientele was rougher, and the various additional services available on the premises were as much the point as the food. You worked in the middle range, or perhaps slightly above, where the wine was adequate and the clients had some money and a degree of discretion could be maintained. The tavern keeper had an economic relationship with you that was not exactly employment, but was not entirely separate from it. You might have a standing arrangement, paying a percentage of your earnings for the use of the premises, or you might have a more informal arrangement based on the drinks you encouraged clients to buy, which were how many Roman tavern keepers made a significant portion of their income. The commission on the wine consumed in the course of your professional socializing was a meaningful contribution to the establishment's revenue. The tavern keeper had an interest in your presence and an interest in your continued successful operation, but the interest was commercial rather than personal, and the protection it implied was limited to the protection of a commercial relationship. The work itself, the social performance, the conversation and the laughter, and the deliberate display of warmth and availability, was demanding in a way that was distinct from its physical component, and in some ways harder to maintain. Being present, attentive, and appealing hour after hour to men in various states of intoxication and expectation required a specific kind of sustained effort that drew on reserves of patience and composure that the evening eroded steadily. You had developed, as everyone who does this kind of work develops, a version of yourself that could be present for the work while the deeper self was somewhere slightly separate from it, and the maintenance of that distinction between the professional surface and the private interior was one of the constant background tasks of the evening. The negotiations that preceded transactions were their own skill set. The price, the terms, the specific nature of what was being agreed. These were not always explicit conversations, because the conventions of the situation meant that much was communicated through implication and understood through shared knowledge of how these things worked. You knew how to read what a client wanted and what he was likely to pay without the explicit negotiation that would have felt too commercial and that the client preferred not to have to acknowledge directly, because the fiction that this was something other than a transaction was one that served both parties' comfort, however hollow it was. The room you took clients to was your own room, or a room in the tavern, or another space maintained for the purpose. The specific logistics depended on the arrangement and the client. The basic physical space of a transaction in this setting was small, private enough for its purpose, and equipped with the minimum required for comfort: a bed or its equivalent, a lamp, perhaps a basin of water. The curtain or the door provided the privacy that Roman housing rarely offered as a permanent condition, and within that privacy the transaction took place, and when it was over the client departed, and you reassessed the evening's state and prepared for the next. The volume of transactions in an evening varied by season, by the calendar of public events, by the day of the week, by weather, by simple chance. A day of games in the Colosseum brought men into the streets in large celebratory numbers. A cold, wet evening kept people indoors. The flux was built into the work and could not be managed out of it, only accommodated. The evenings that produced more income were not necessarily the better evenings, and the evenings that were quieter were not necessarily welcome. The economics did not allow for rest without consequence, and the knowledge of that was always present. The health consequences of your life accumulated in ways that the morning accounting in your room tracked, however imprecisely, over time. The Romans had a medical culture that was, by the standards of the ancient world, relatively sophisticated. The Hippocratic tradition had been transmitted through Greek medicine, and Roman physicians of the imperial period included both genuinely skilled practitioners and a significant number of charlatans and incompetents who were impossible to reliably distinguish from each other without the specific knowledge that most patients did not have. What medicine could offer you was real but limited, and what it could not offer was the majority of what you actually needed. The sexual health consequences of your profession were the most immediate and most significant. Sexually transmitted infections that would be treatable or manageable with modern medicine were, in the ancient world, conditions that progressed largely without effective treatment, producing a range of effects from the uncomfortable and manageable to the seriously debilitating and eventually fatal. The Romans had some awareness of the various conditions associated with sexual activity. There are medical texts that describe symptoms recognizable as gonorrhea, and the long course of syphilis may be represented in some ancient skeletal records. But the understanding of transmission, the mechanisms of infection, and the possibility of effective treatment were all absent. What you had access to were the herbal preparations, the dietary modifications, the various rituals of postcoital hygiene that circulated among women of your profession as practical knowledge, transmitted horizontally through the community of women in similar situations, carrying real information and real misinformation in a mixture that you had no way to reliably separate. Pregnancy was the other major health consideration, and it was one that required active management throughout your working life. Contraception in Rome was not absent. The ancient world had developed various methods, from the use of various pessaries and barriers to the use of plants with recognized abortifacient properties, from abstinence at fertile periods based on a theory of fertility that was not entirely accurate to the more extreme solution of abortion itself, which Roman law and Roman medical ethics treated with more ambivalence than later Christian societies would. The silphium plant from North Africa, which was a standard component of ancient contraceptive and abortifacient preparations, was harvested to extinction partly because of the scale of demand for it, which tells you something about how prevalent this kind of need was. What the methods available actually achieved in terms of effectiveness is a question that the ancient sources cannot fully answer, but that the high incidence of infant exposure and the records of maternal mortality in ancient sources make clear was not a fully solved problem. Infant exposure, the practice of leaving unwanted infants, typically in specified public places, to either be taken in by someone who wanted a child or slave or to die of exposure, was legal and practiced throughout the Roman period, and it was a practice that you, or women in your situation, might have had reason to know about at closer range than most. A pregnancy that was carried to term and resulted in a child that could not be supported within your economic circumstances was a problem that Roman society solved in this specific, brutal way, and the emotional weight of that solution was something that the legal sanction did not reduce, and that the practical necessity did not resolve. The cosmetics that you applied daily were, we have noted, toxic. The white lead that gave you the pale complexion Roman beauty standards required was accumulating in your body over the years of its use, and the effects of lead poisoning, the fatigue, the cognitive effects, the neurological symptoms, developed slowly enough that the connection between the cosmetic and the condition was not made in the ancient world, although some writers noted that regular cosmetic users seemed to age in particular ways. You did not know what was happening. You knew only that the standards required it, and that your professional life required meeting those standards. The general conditions of urban poverty, the poor air quality from the cooking fires and the industry, the contaminated water supply despite the aqueducts, the crowded housing and its implications for the transmission of respiratory illness, the inadequate diet in the years when money was short, all contributed to a health profile that was typical of the Roman urban poor, and that had the usual features: chronic conditions that reduced life expectancy significantly below what adequate nutrition, clean water, and good housing would have permitted, acute episodes of illness that were either survived or were not, and a body that aged faster than its calendar years. The life expectancy of a Roman woman in your circumstances is not something the ancient sources give us with any precision, but the general Roman figures, themselves complicated to interpret, suggest that reaching 50 was genuinely exceptional rather than expected, and that the second half of what we would consider a normal lifespan was not something most Romans of the lower classes could take for granted. This was not a fact you thought about directly, for the same reason that people in high risk occupations generally do not think about actuarial tables when they have work to do. It was the background against which everything happened, the slow, unspoken context that gave the pleasures of the present day their particular quality. You did not come from nowhere. Nobody does. And the question of where you came from, The specific circumstances that had brought you to this life in this city is one that Roman sources address more honestly than later, more moralistic periods tended to. Rome was not naive about the economic and social forces that produced the population of its brothels and its streets, even if its legal system was not organized around addressing those forces. The largest single source of women in the Roman sex trade was slavery. Enslaved women in Rome could be required to perform sexual services for their enslaved owners' clients, could be set to work in a brothel as a commercial venture by an enslaved owner, could be sold specifically for use in sexual commerce. The law had some provisions nominally protecting enslaved women from certain abuses, but the protections were limited and inconsistently applied, and the practical reality was that an enslaved woman's sexual availability to her owner and to whomever her owner directed was assumed under Roman law. Freed women, women who had been enslaved and subsequently manumitted, might find that their manumission had been conditional, that the obligations of their patron included sexual availability, that freedom in the formal legal sense did not mean freedom in the practical sense. The path from enslavement into the free sex trade was well worn, and in the Roman social context, unremarkable to everyone except the women who walked it. You may have been born into your situation. The daughter of a meretrix was almost automatically assigned the same legal status as her mother, regardless of who her father was or whether he acknowledged her, because Roman citizen status passed through the legitimate father, and a meretrix's children were presumed illegitimate. The daughter of a woman of infamia inherited that infamia before she had done anything to earn it, which meant that the life you were born into closed off the alternatives before you had any ability to choose among them. This was not a paradox or an inconsistency in the Roman system. It was a feature of a system that wanted to reproduce its own categories across generations, that needed a population for the role required, and that found hereditary transmission of status the most efficient way to supply that need. You may have come from the provinces. The enormous influx of people from across the empire into Rome that kept the city's population stable despite its terrible mortality rates included women who had been trafficked, women who had come voluntarily seeking some better life than the province offered and had found the city's welcome very specific, women who had been the wives or daughters of men who had died or failed or been ruined, and who had arrived in the city with nothing and found that their options were more limited than they had imagined. The city received all of these women and had a specific destination for them that was as reliable as gravity. You may have been free-born and poor and making the specific calculation that many poor women in many eras have made, that the work available to poor women, the mills, the laundries, the weaving shops, the domestic service that was itself often not clearly distinguishable from the sexual service that came with it, paid less and offered less independence than the sex trade, and that the legal stigma of infamia was an abstract consideration against the concrete reality of not being able to pay the rent. The Roman sources that mention this calculation do so with varying degrees of sympathy and condescension, but they acknowledge it, which is more than some later periods managed. Whatever your background, you had arrived at where you were through a combination of circumstances that were not entirely within your control and choices that had been made within whatever space for choice remained. Roman moral philosophy, Stoicism in particular, which was the dominant ethical framework of the educated classes, had a great deal to say about the importance of choosing virtue regardless of circumstances, of maintaining inner freedom even under external constraint. What it had much less to say was how a woman with infamia, no citizen rights, no property, no family connections, and no alternative income was supposed to manifest that inner freedom in the material world. The philosophy was for people whose material circumstances provided enough floor to stand on while they worked on their souls. You had your own kind of philosophy, worked out in the specific conditions of your actual life, which was considerably more practically grounded and which had its own kind of wisdom, even if no one was writing it down. There is a version of your story that is only about what was done to you, what was taken from you, what the structures of Roman society required you to be and prevented you from becoming. That version is true, and it is important, and it would be dishonest to minimize it. But it is not the whole story, and the part it leaves out is the part about who you actually were when you were not being an instrument of the city's various needs. The women who worked similar territory to you were the primary social world you moved through, and the relationships among them were as various and as human as any relationships. There were genuine friendships, the specific bond that develops between people who share a difficult situation and who extend to each other the understanding and the practical assistance that the situation generates. There were rivalries, sometimes petty and sometimes serious, over clients and territory and the small competitive advantages of the professional world. There were the older women who knew more than you did and who shared that knowledge or withheld it according to their own calculations. There were the younger women who were where you had been a few years ago and whose situation you watched with whatever combination of sympathy and self-recognition was available. The information that circulated among women in your community was practical and important. Which clients were reliable and which were volatile, which physicians were competent and which were predatory, which landlords were tolerable and which were impossible, which neighborhoods were becoming more dangerous and which were safer than they used to be, what the current prices were, and what the market would bear. This was professional intelligence of the kind that any trade required, and it was transmitted through the informal networks of women who had occasion to talk to each other in the baths, at the food counters, in the streets, in the brief social spaces between one client and the next. There was also the kind of mutual aid that poverty and insecurity generated, the covering for each other when illness made work impossible, the lending of small sums that might or might not be repaid, the shared lookout that made the night streets somewhat safer, the practical solidarity of a community that had no formal institutions to rely on and had created informal ones instead. These were not perfectly functioning systems. They broke down, were exploited, failed when the stresses on them were too great. But they were real, and they were built by the women themselves out of the same limited materials they built everything else from. You had, within the constraints of your situation, pleasures that were genuinely yours. There was music. Rome was a musical city, and the informal music of the street and the tavern was accessible without cost or status. There was the particular pleasure of a day when the money was enough and the work had gone smoothly, and the city was warm, and you had bought yourself something good to eat, and had nothing urgently pressing until the evening. There was the pleasure of a conversation that went somewhere unexpected, the client who turned out to be genuinely interesting, the woman at the bath who made you laugh in a way you were not expecting, the old man at the thermopolium who told stories about Rome 50 years ago that were more vivid than anything you had encountered in the official version. There was the pleasure of knowing this city, of knowing it in the specific, bodily, intimate way that came from having moved through it and worked in it and survived in it for years, of knowing which streets flooded in the rain and which taverns watered their wine and which magistrate was taking which bribes and which street corner produced the best hearing of the musicians who played there on summer evenings. Rome was, for all that it had done to you, and all that it continued to require of you, your city. You knew it in a way that the senator in his Palatine mansion did not, in a way that the tourist from Alexandria could never achieve. The Subura was yours in the specific sense that comes from having lived inside a place rather than above it or beside it, and the knowledge of it, practical, social, sensory, was a form of belonging that the law could not take from you because it was not a legal thing. It was simply the accumulated weight of years in a specific place, laid down layer by layer, the way sediment is laid down, until the place and the person had become the kind of complicated thing that is difficult to separate. Your relationship to the gods deserves real attention, because Roman religious life was woven into the daily life of even the most marginalized citizens in ways that are easy to underestimate from a secular modern perspective, and because the specific texture of how you engaged with the divine reflects something important about who you were beyond the category the law assigned you. The household gods, the lares and penates, were acknowledged in the small shrines of even the most modest apartments. A niche in the wall with a painted figure, a small oil lamp kept burning before it, the daily gesture of acknowledgement that the household was under divine protection. Even in your single room, with its low ceiling and its bare stone floor, you had some equivalent of this. A small figurine, perhaps, or a painting on the plaster, or simply a particular lamp kept burning in a particular corner that served the purpose that purpose required. The ritual was not elaborate. It did not need to be. It was the daily acknowledgement that the forces governing human life were larger than human life, and that maintaining a relationship with them, however modest the maintenance, was better than not. The street shrines, the Compitalia crossroads altars, the various neighborhood religious observances that punctuated the Roman calendar were part of the texture of city life, and were not, in their practice, particularly exclusive. The great festivals of Rome, the Saturnalia, the Floralia, with its specific associations with your profession and its specific license for public celebration, the various games and public sacrifices that mark the Roman religious year, were public events in the fullest sense, accessible to the street, participated in by the street, celebrated with the democratic energy of a city that used its festivals as pressure valves for the accumulated tension of ordinary urban life. The Floralia, in particular, was yours in a specific way, associated as it was with the goddess Flora, and with theatrical performances, and with a general relaxation of social constraints that the rest of the year maintained more strictly, a period when the street life of Rome became briefly more like the street life you inhabited year round, and the rest of the city briefly joined you in it. Your access to official Roman state religion was limited by your infamia. The major temples and their most sacred ceremonies were not uniformly open to you, and certain priesthoods and religious offices were explicitly reserved for women of certified chastity and respectable status, the Vestal Virgins being the extreme example of the kind of institutionalized female virtue that was your precise opposite in the Roman symbolic scheme. But the folk religious life of the city, the shrines to Isis and to Cybele and to various Eastern deities whose cults had flowed into Rome along the trade routes, the informal religion of the urban poor that had always coexisted with the official state cult, was more accessible, more accepting of marginalized worshippers, more immediately responsive to the specific needs of people whose prayers were not about civic glory, but about surviving the week. The cult of Isis, in particular, with its promise of divine care for the marginalized and its acceptance of women in active religious roles, had attracted a substantial following in Rome's poorer and more diverse districts by the imperial period, and the comfort it offered, the sense of being seen and valued by a divine power that was not organized around the specific civic hierarchies that placed you at the bottom, was real and available to you in a way that the official state religion was not. You had your own relationships with the divine, worked out in the specific circumstances of your actual life, and they were as real as anyone else's, and perhaps more fervently maintained because the specific circumstances of your life gave you more immediate and more pressing reasons to seek whatever divine attention was available. The night deepens, and eventually the work slows. Not all at once. Rome's evening life had no formal closing time, and the taverns that held their licenses and their nerve stayed open until the clientele thinned to the point where staying open cost more than it earned. But there is a point in the late night when the energy of the evening has spent itself, when the streets have shed their earlier density, when the men who had money and appetites and the freedom to indulge them have mostly made their various destinations, and the city has reduced to its essential late-night population, the people who work nights, the people who cannot afford shelter and sleep where they can find it, the occasional insomniac, the cart drivers making their nocturnal permitted runs. This is when you go home. The walk back through the dark streets is a thing you have done hundreds of times, and your body knows it well enough that you could do it mostly on memory, navigating the familiar sequence of turns and street corners and the specific quality of each section of road, the well-paved stretch near the better apartment buildings, the rougher stones where the maintenance has been neglected, the alley where you keep to the middle away from the doorways. The lamp you carry makes a small circle of light that moves with you and makes everything outside the circle correspondingly darker, which is a specific quality of moving through a pre-electric city at night that is difficult to fully imagine from outside it. What you carry home from the evening is money, counted and assessed before you left, the accounting done in your head before you were out of the door. The money is real, and the money is tonight's security, and you are aware of it as you walk in the way that you are aware of any valuable you are carrying through a dark street. You also carry the evening itself, The accumulated weight of hours of social performance, of the managing of various men's expectations and moods, of the effort that the work required and that you have been spending steadily since you left home, and that is now at a low ebb. The tiredness is specific, not the simple physical tiredness of a day's labor, though there is that too, but the particular tiredness that comes from extended social effort, from sustained vigilance, from the small constant calculations of an evening's professional navigation. It is the kind of tired that sleep helps with, but does not entirely resolve. The room, when you get back to it, is dark and cold in the winter months, warmer in summer. You light the lamp from whatever ember has survived in the small brazier you keep for warmth and light, and the room comes into its familiar form: the walls, the bed, the small collection of objects that constitutes your material life, a basin, a small jar of oil, whatever money you have accumulated over the recent weeks, stored in whatever concealment you trust. The toga or the dress you are wearing goes on whatever surface it goes on. The cosmetics you will not remove until morning, because removing them now with cold water in a dim room is more effort than it is worth tonight. The accounting of the day is done unconsciously as you settle: the money taken, the money owed, the money needed, the client who paid promptly, the one who required managing, the one who tried something that required more active management than you had energy for and that you are still carrying a residue of. The small things that went right and the things that did not. The bed, the straw mattress or the wooden frame with its thin covering, receives you, and the city sounds that have been the background of your entire life continue their low maintenance of the night outside. Carts, voices distant, a dog somewhere. The particular sound of Rome at this hour, reduced to its essential self. You have survived another day. In a life like yours, in a city like this, under laws like the ones that govern your existence, that is not nothing. It is not small. The survival is daily, repeated, accumulated day by day, into something that begins to look like a life, because it is a life, whatever the law says about what kind of life it is, and whatever the law says about what kind of person is living it. You are a person living in Rome, in one of the most extraordinary cities in the history of the world, in one of the most complex and demanding social positions that city contained. You are navigating it with the tools you have, which are not the tools that were provided to you by any benevolent institution, but the tools you have assembled yourself over years from whatever was available. You are doing it. That is the whole account. The lamp burns low. The night continues outside. And in the specific darkness of your specific room, on the specific floor of the specific building, in the specific neighborhood of the city that is yours, in the only way that really matters, you are still, for another night, here. Rome talked about women like you constantly. The poets wrote about you. The satirists wrote about you. The moralists wrote about you at enormous length. The legal commentators wrote about you. The medical writers wrote about you. There is more surviving text about the meretrix in Roman literature than there is about most categories of Roman women, which is a strange form of visibility, to be extensively described while being extensively marginalized, to occupy a great deal of cultural space while having very little social space in which to actually exist. The poets were the most immediately interesting because Roman love poetry of the late Republic and early empire, the work of Catullus, Tibullus, Propertius, Ovid, was substantially organized around the figure of the available woman, the meretrix or the freed woman, or the courtesan who could be addressed in terms that would have been impossible in a poem to a respectable wife. The beloved of Roman elegy is almost always a woman of uncertain or low status, and the freedom that gives the poet to express passion and frustration and obsession and longing is inseparable from the freedom that her social position gives both parties to conduct the relationship outside the legal and social constraints of marriage. Catullus's Lesbia, Propertius's Cynthia, Tibullus's Delia, Ovid's Corinna. All of these are poetic constructions of women who were available in the ways that matrons were not, and the poetry that was written about them is some of the most vivid and technically accomplished in the Latin tradition. What the poets made of women in your position was not, however, a simple or straightforward tribute. The elegiac tradition was also a tradition of complaint and manipulation, of the lover demanding fidelity from a woman whose freedom he simultaneously required for the relationship to exist at all. The meretrix was beloved when she was exclusively devoted to the poet's needs, and she was venal and faithless when she accepted the gifts of other men, which was the commercial basis of her entire existence and the thing she could not have survived without. The logic was impossible. Be free enough to be available, but faithful enough to belong only to me, and it was applied to real women who had to navigate it with real consequences. The man who was writing love poetry about you was also capable of writing bitter satirical poetry about you when your choices did not align with his preferences, and the shift in register was swift. The satirists were less interested in individual women and more interested in the category, which is to say they were less interested in you as a person and more interested in what you represented as a cultural symbol. Juvenal, writing in the early 2nd century CE, is the extreme example. His portraits of women of your kind are images of corruption and degradation, of Rome in moral decline expressed through female sexuality run amok, of the Republic's ancient virtue undermined by luxury and license. The women in Juvenal's satires are not people but arguments, and the argument they illustrate is about the decadence of the present against the imagined virtue of the past. Reading Juvenal is informative, not about what women like you were actually like, but about what anxious Roman men of a certain class and sensibility felt about the world they were living in and needed a specific kind of woman to embody. The medical writers were matter of fact in a way that was almost a relief. Soranus of Ephesus, whose gynecological treatise was one of the most influential medical texts of the imperial period, discussed the physiology of women in your profession in clinical terms that were attentive to the practical realities of your health situation without the moralizing overlay of the satirists or the romantic idealization of the elegists. His concerns were practical: contraception, the management of various gynecological conditions, the effects of sexual activity on the body, and his tone was the tone of a professional describing a professional situation. The medical gaze was not a warm one, but it was at least a gaze that recognized you as a body with needs rather than a symbol with a function. What you knew about all of this, how much of the literary culture that surrounded your existence you actually encountered and what you made of it, depended on your literacy and your situation and the specific circles your work brought you into. A woman working the lower levels of the Subura trade probably had limited direct encounter with the poems of Ovid. A woman in the better kind of arrangement, entertaining men of the educated classes, probably knew exactly what was written about women in her position and had developed her own running commentary on it, which she may or may not have shared with anyone, and which was almost certainly sharper and more precise than anything the men who wrote the poems imagined. The poems were written about you. They were not written for you or to you, and the difference between being the subject of a poem and being its intended reader is the difference between being observed and being seen. What Rome's extensive discourse about women like you actually communicated, beneath all the poetry and the satire and the legal commentary, was a specific cultural anxiety about female sexuality and its containment. The meretrix existed in Roman cultural imagination partly as the necessary outlet that channeled male desire away from respectable women, and partly as the figure who embodied the terrifying possibility of female desire and female independence operating outside the structures of family and marriage that Roman civic order depended on. She was useful and she was threatening in exactly equal measure, and Roman culture managed that combination by talking about her constantly in ways that kept her category legible while keeping her person invisible. You were very much talked about and very rarely actually heard from, which is an imbalance that has survived into the scholarship of later centuries and that we are still slowly beginning to correct. There is a version of the argument that says women in your position in Rome were in certain respects freer than respectable Roman women, and it is worth spending some time with this argument because it contains something real, even as it contains something that needs to be carefully examined. The Roman matrona, the respectable married woman of citizen status, was in many ways more constrained in her daily life than you were in yours. She could not, in theory, go unescorted to most public places. Her social interactions with men outside her immediate family were subject to scrutiny and comment. Her financial independence was limited. Under Roman law, married women were subject to various constraints on their property and financial dealings, though these had been loosened considerably by the imperial period from their earlier severity. Her clothing told the world what she was and required her to perform that identity consistently. Her sexual behavior was monitored, and its deviation from the expected norm was a criminal matter. She was, in the deepest sense, an institution rather than entirely a person, the embodiment of her family's honor, the guarantor of her children's legitimate status, the representative of a set of civic values that she carried in her body and her behavior, whether she had chosen those values or not. You had infamia, which meant you had already lost the legal protections that the respectable woman's virtue gave her. But infamia also meant, in a paradoxical way, that you were released from certain of the performances that respectable status required. The matrona had to be chaste. She had no choice in the matter, because unchastity was a criminal offense for her. You had no chastity to perform, which meant you had, in that specific domain, a freedom that was the direct result of having nothing to protect. You could move through the city more freely than a respectable woman could, because the specific modesty required of respectable women in public spaces was not required of you. You could interact with a wider range of men in a wider range of settings. You could earn your own money and manage it yourself, inadequately, under a system that gave you limited legal protection for what you earned, but yourself, without the intermediary of a husband or father or guardian. You could, in principle, choose your clients, refuse specific work, negotiate the terms of your situation in ways that the respectable married woman had no equivalent space for. This is the argument, and there is something in it. The freedom from the specific constraints of respectable femininity was real, and women who had come from situations of enslaved domesticity or from the rigid supervision of a traditional household sometimes found the relative autonomy of the meretrix's life, however dangerous and however marginalized, to be something, a kind of air, a kind of movement. The ability to walk down a street on a Tuesday afternoon without anyone asking where you were going. But the argument requires qualification that it rarely receives, and the qualification is significant. The freedom you had was freedom within a very specific and very small space. Outside that space, the constraints were, if anything, more severe than those on the respectable woman, not less. The respectable woman had legal protections you did not have. She had social standing you did not have. She had a future, old age with her children, the respect of grandchildren, the honors due to the matriarch, that was not available to you in the same form. The freedom you had was the freedom of someone who had already been placed outside the walls. You were outside them and could move within the extramural space, but the walls were still there, and everything inside them, the legal protection, the social honor, the economic security of a legitimate family, the claim to be a full person in the society's own accounting, was still on the other side, and the going back was not available to you. The Roman term infamia meant at its root being outside the fama, outside the good name, outside the reputation, outside the social recognition that constituted citizenship as a lived experience rather than a legal status. To have infamia was to be outside the community of good names, which meant outside the community of people who were counted as full moral agents by the society's own standards. And being outside that community was not primarily a spiritual or psychological condition, but a practical one with practical consequences for every transaction and every interaction that the law and social custom touched. What freedom looked like from where you stood was not the romantic freedom of the woman unburdened by convention. It was the freedom of someone who had been pushed to the margin and who had found, in the margin, some room to move that the center did not provide. It was a freedom made of what remained after the taking. And recognizing that the space you moved in had been defined by exclusion rather than by choice, is part of the honest account of your life that the poets and the satirists and the legal commentators never quite managed to provide. You were a person in a city navigating the specific conditions of your specific situation, making what you could of the life available to you. That is a description that applies to almost everyone in almost every era. The specific conditions in your case were severe, and the life available to you was constrained in ways that the society that constrained it rarely acknowledged, but you were there. You were alive. You were moving through Rome with the knowledge of someone who had learned it at close range and at real cost, and whatever else that was, it was something that was entirely and irreducibly yours. That is where we leave you. in your room, in your city, at the end of your long, specific day, the lamp burning low, the sounds of Rome continuing outside, the carts beginning their permitted nocturnal rumble through the narrow streets, the dog somewhere distant, the particular smell of the city at night, salt and smoke and stone and the distant river, the city reducing to its essential self the way everything reduces when the performance of the day has finally ended, and you still here, which is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the whole point. Let me step back from the second person just for a moment before we let the night settle all the way down. The Roman meretrix was a real person, millions of real people across the centuries that Rome operated as a city, and her life was neither the cautionary tale that Roman moralists made of it, nor the romantic fantasy that later centuries sometimes substituted. It was a life lived inside a set of constraints that were as precise and as specifically designed as any the ancient world produced, under a legal and social system that had thought very carefully about what to do with her and had arrived at conclusions that were convenient for almost everyone except herself. What she had inside those constraints was what everyone has inside their constraints, the particular texture of their own specific days, the people they knew and how they knew them, the pleasures that were available and the ones that were not, the accumulated knowledge of a specific place and a specific time that no one who had not been there could fully possess. She had a city that was, for all its indifference and its violence and its precise legal devaluation of her existence, also one of the most vivid and complex human creations the world had produced up to that point. She moved through it every day and knew it in the specific, embodied way of someone who has lived in a place rather than visited it. She did not survive as a Roman courtesan in the end. Nobody does. The life was hard, and the body aged, and the options narrowed, and the city continued without her. But while it lasted, it was hers, in the only way that any life is anyone's, completely, specifically, without replacement. That is the honest account. Rest now. Let Rome recede into the distance it came from, becoming quieter and quieter, the marble cooling and the lamps going out one by one, until it is just another city in the dark, somewhere very far back in time, with all its people in it, getting on with the ordinary, extraordinary business of being alive. You are safe, you are warm, the day is finished. Thank you for spending this long, slow evening in ancient Rome. I hope it carried you somewhere quiet, and if you drifted off somewhere around the baths or the dark streets or the lamplight at the end of the day, that is exactly right. You can always find your way back to the rest of it another night. If drowsy history is helping you sleep, the kindest thing you can do is subscribe, just quietly, whenever you remember, no rush at all, so these long histories keep finding the people who need them. It keeps the channel going and means more of these slow, detailed human stories keep arriving. Drop a comment when you wake. Tell me where you were listening from and what time it was. I read everyone, usually with something warm, and I am always glad to know where in the world these quiet evenings are reaching. Rest well, breathe slowly. Let sleep come in its own time, the way it always does when you stop trying to catch it. Good night.